Search for a Method by Jean-Paul Sartre. This is the second part of chapter 3. As a child, Flaubert feels that he is deprived of paternal affection because of his older brother. Achille resembles the father of Flaubert. In order to please his father, Gustave would have to imitate Achille. In sulky resentment, the child refuses to do so. When he enters college, Gustave finds the situation unchanged. 9 years earlier, Achille, a brilliant student, has already won all the first places and earned the approval of the chief physician. If his younger brother hopes to win the esteem of his father, he must get the same grades for the same assignments as his older brother. He refuses without even formulating his refusal. This means that an unrecognized resistance hampers him in his work. He will be an average student, which in the Flaubert household is a disgrace. This second situation is nothing other than the first one, further restricted by the new factor, which is the college. Gustave's contacts with his fellow students are not dominant conditions. The family problem is so serious for him that he is not concerned about other relations. If he is humiliated by the success of certain of his fellow students, it is solely because their honors confirm the superiority of Achille, who took the prize for excellence in every class. The third moment comes when Flaubert consents to study law. In order to be sure of being different from Achille, he decides to be inferior to him. He will hate his future career as the proof of this inferiority. He will launch into an idealist overcompensation, and finally, faced with becoming an attorney, he will get himself out of it by attacks of hysteria. This third moment is an enrichment and a further restriction of the initial conditions. Each phase, isolated, seems to be a repetition. The movement proceeding from childhood to nervous breakdowns is, on the contrary, a perpetual surpassing of these givens. The end product is Gustave Flaubert's commitment to literature. But at the same time that these givens are a past surpassed, they appear in every operation as a past surpassing, that is, as a future. Our roles are always future. They appear to each one as tasks to be performed, ambushes to be avoided, powers to be exercised, etc. It may be that paternity is a role, as certain American sociologists claim. It may be also that a particular young married man hopes to become a father in order to be identified with or to substitute himself for his own father, or, on the other hand, to free himself of his father by assuming his father's attitude. In any case, this past relation with his parents, or at least a relation which has been lived profoundly in the past, manifests itself to him only as the line of flight in a new enterprise. Paternity opens to him a life until his death. If it is a role, it is a role which one invents, which one does not cease to learn again under circumstances always new, and which one hardly knows until the moment of death. Complex is the style of life and the revelation of the past surpassing as a future to be created are one and the same reality. It is the project as an oriented life, as man's affirmation through action, and at the same time it is that mist of irrationality which cannot be located, which is reflected from the future in our childhood memories and from our childhood and our rational choices as mature men. The second observation which we should make refers to the totalization as a movement of history and as a theoretical and practical attempt to situate an event, a group, or a man. I have remarked earlier that a single act can be evaluated at more and more complex levels, and that consequently it is expressed by a series of very diverse significations. One should not conclude, as certain philosophers do, that these significations remain independent, separated, so to speak, by impassable distances. Of course, the Marxist is not generally guilty of this fault. He shows how the significations of superstructures are produced in terms of substructures. He may go further and show, along with their autonomy, the symbolic function of certain practices or certain superstructural beliefs. My cats are acting like dicks. But this cannot suffice for the totalization as a dialectical process of revelation. The superimposed significations are isolated and enumerated by analysis. The movement which has joined them together in life is, on the contrary, synthetic. The conditioning remains the same. Therefore, neither the importance of the factors nor their order is changed. But we will lose sight of human reality if we do not consider the significations as synthetic, multidimensional, indissoluble objects which hold individual places in a space-time with multiple dimensions. The mistake here is to reduce the lived signification to the simple linear statement which language gives it. We have seen that the individual revolt of the airplane thief is a particularization of the collective revolt of the colonized. At the same time, it is, in addition, by its very incarnation, an emancipating act. We must understand that this complex relation between the collective revolt and the individual obsession can neither be reduced to a metaphorical bond nor dissolved in generality. The concrete presence of the object of the obsession, the airplane, the practical concerns, how to get into it, when, etc., are irreducibles. This man did not want to make a political demonstration. He was concerned with his individual destiny. But we know also that what he was doing, the collective demand, the emancipating scandal, had to be implicitly contained by what he believed himself to be doing. What, moreover, he was doing too, for he stole the plane, he piloted it, and he was killed in France. It is impossible then to separate these two significations or to reduce one to the other. They are two inseparable faces of a single object. And here is a third, the relation to death, that is, the refusal and assumption, both together, of a forbidden future. This death expresses at the same time the impossible revolt of his people, hence his actual relation with the colonizers, the radical totality of his hate and refusal, and finally the inward project of this man, his choice of a brief, dazzling freedom, of a freedom to die. These various aspects of the relation to death are in turn united and are irreducible to one another. They bestow new dimensions on the act. At the same time, they reflect the relation to the colonizers and the obsessional relation to the object. That is, the dimensions earlier unveiled, and they are reflected in these dimensions. These determinations contain and collect together within themselves the revolt by death and the freedom to die. Naturally, we are lacking certain other information. We do not know just what childhood, what experience, what material conditions characterize the man and color the project. There is no doubt, however, that each one of these determinations would add its own richness, would contain the others within itself. Whatever the childhood may have been, was it not the apprenticeship for this desperate condition, for this future without a future, etc.? The line from death to childhood is so narrow, so rapid in all of us, that we too may ask ourselves whether there has not been since our first years a project of bearing witness to die, etc. By a particular illumination, each of these determinations would demonstrate to us its own existence in the other as significations, as the collapsed presence, as the irrational bond between certain signs, etc. And do we not believe that the very materiality of life is there too as a fundamental condition and as an objective signification of all these significations? The novelist will show us first one, then the other of these dimensions as thoughts alternating in the mind of his hero. But the novelist will be lying. It is not thoughts which are involved, at least not necessarily, and all are given together, not one at a time. The man is locked up inside. He does not cease to be bound by all these walls which enclose him, or to know that he is immured. All of these walls make a single prison, and this prison is a single life, a single act. Each signification is transformed, continues to be transformed, and its transformation has repercussions on all the others. What the totalization must discover, therefore, is the multidimensional unity of the act. Our ancient habits of thought risk oversimplifying this unity, a condition of both reciprocal interpenetration and the relative autonomy of significations. The present form of language is hardly fit to restore it, yet it is with these poor means and these bad habits that we must try to render the complex, polyvalent unity of these facets of the dialectical law of their correspondences, that is, of the connections of each one with each other and of each one with all. The dialectical knowing of man, according to Hegel and Marx, demands a new rationality, because nobody has been willing to establish this rationality within experience. I state as a fact, absolutely no one, either in the East or in the West, writes or speaks a sentence or a word about us and our contemporaries that is not a gross error. The project must of necessity cut across the field of instrumental possibilities. The particular quality of the instruments transforms it more or less profoundly. They condition the objectification. Now the instrument itself, whatever it may be, is the product of a certain development of techniques and, in the final analysis, of the productive forces. Since our theme is philosophical, I shall take my examples from the cultural sphere. It must be understood that whatever an ideological project may be in appearance, its ultimate goal is to change the basic situation by becoming aware of its contradictions. Sprung from a particular conflict which expresses the universality of class and condition, it aims at surpassing it in order to reveal it in order to make it manifest to all, to manifest it in order to resolve it. But between the simple revelation and the public manifestation, there is interposed a field restricted and defined by cultural instruments and by language. The development of productive forces conditions scientific knowledge, which in turn conditions it. The relations of production, through this knowledge, outline the lineaments of a philosophy. The concrete and lived history gives birth to particular systems of ideas, which, within the framework of this philosophy, express the real and practical attitudes of defined social groups. These words are charged with new significations. Their universal meaning is narrowed and deepened. The word nature in the 18th century creates an immediate complicity among those who question it. We are not speaking here of a strict signification, and they never left off discussing the idea of nature at the time of Diderot. But this philosophical motif, this theme, was understood by everyone. Thus, the general categories of the culture, the particular systems, and the language which expresses them are already the objectification of a class, the reflection of conflicts, latent or declared, and the particular manifestation of alienation. The world is outside. Language and culture are not inside the individual like stamps registered by his nervous system. It is the individual who is inside culture and inside language, that is, inside a special section of the field of instruments. In order to manifest what he uncovers, he therefore has at his disposal elements both too rich and too few. Too few words, types of reasoning, methods, exist only in limited quantity. Among them there are empty spaces, lacunae, and his growing thought cannot find its appropriate expression. Too rich, each vocable brings along with it the profound signification which the whole epoch has given to it. As soon as the ideologist speaks, he says more and something different from what he wants to say. The period steals his thought from him. He constantly veers about, and the idea finally expressed is a profound deviation. He is caught in the mystification of words. The Marquise de Sade, as Simone de Beauvoir has shown, lived the decline of a feudal system, all of whose privileges were being challenged one by one. His famous sadism is a blind attempt to reaffirm in violence his rights as a warrior, founding them on the subjective quality of his person. Now this attempt is already permeated with bourgeois subjectivism. Objective titles of nobility are replaced by an untrammeled superiority on the part of the ego. Fucking cats, man. From the beginning, his impulse toward violence is deviated. But when he wants to go further, he finds himself face to face with the essential idea, the idea of nature. He wants to show that the law of nature is the law of the strongest, that massacres and tortures only reproduce natural destructions, etc. But the idea contains one meaning which throws him off. In the eyes of everyone living in 1789, aristocrat or bourgeois, nature is good. Suddenly, the whole system is going to move off course. Since murder and torture can only imitate nature, this is because the most heinous crimes are good and the finest virtues wicked. At exactly this point, our aristocrat is won over by revolutionary ideas. I lost my spot again. Jesus Christ. By revolutionary ideas. He experiences the contradiction of all the nobles who had been preparing since 1787, what is called today the aristocratic revolution. He is at once both victim, he suffered from the lettre de cachet and spent years in the Bastille, and privileged. This contradiction, which leads others to the guillotine or to forced emigration, he carries over into revolutionary ideology. He demands freedom, which for him would be freedom to kill, and communication among men, when he seeks to manifest to others his own narrow and profound experience of non-communication. His contradictions, his ancient privileges, and his fall condemn him indeed to solitude. He will see his experience of what Stirner will later call the unique, stolen, and deviated by the universal, by rationality, by equality, the concept tools of his period. It is through these that he will try painfully to think himself. The result of all this is that aberrant ideology. The only relation of person to person is that which binds the torturer and his victim. At the same time, this conception is the search for communication through the conflicts and the deviated affirmation of absolute non-communication. It is in these terms that he erects a monstrous work, which it would be wrong to classify too quickly as one of the last vestiges of aristocratic thought, but which appears rather as the claim of the solitary man, grasped opportunely and transformed by the universalist ideology of the revolutionaries. This example shows how wrong contemporary Marxism is in neglecting the particular content of a cultural system and reducing it immediately to the universality of a class ideology. A system is an alienated man who wants to go beyond his alienation, and who gets entangled in alienated words. It is an achievement of awareness which finds itself deviated by its own instruments, and which the culture transforms into a particular Weltanschauung. It is at the same time a struggle of thought against its social instruments, an effort to direct them, to empty them of their superfluity, to compel them to express only the thought itself. The consequence of these contradictions is the fact that an ideological system is an irreducible, since the instruments, whatever they are, alienate the one who employs them and modify the means of his action. The idea must be considered to be both the objectification of the concrete man and his alienation. The idea is the man himself externalizing himself in the materiality of language. It is important, therefore, to study it in all its developments, to discover its subjective signification, that is, for the one who expresses it, and its intentionality in order to understand its deviations and to pass at last to its objective realization. Thus we will verify the fact that history is tricky, as Lenin said, and that we underestimate its tricks. We will discover that the majority of the works of the mind are complex objects, difficult to classify, that one can rarely situate them in relation to a single class ideology, but rather that they reproduce in their profound structure the contradictions and struggles of contemporary ideologies. We will realize that we must not see in a bourgeois system today the simple negation of revolutionary materialism. On the contrary, we must show how the system responds to the attraction of this philosophy, how the philosophy is included in it, how the attractions and repulsions, influences, gentle forces of insinuation, or violent conflicts pursue one another inside each idea, how the idealism of a Western thinker is defined by an arrest of thought, by a refusal to develop certain themes already present. In short, by a sort of incompleteness rather than as a carnival of subjectivity. Sade's thought is neither that of an aristocrat nor that of a bourgeois. It is the lived hope of a noble, outlawed by his class, who has found no means of expressing himself except through the dominant concepts of the rising class, and who made use of these concepts by perverting them and by distorting himself through them. In particular, revolutionary universalism, which marks the attempt of the bourgeoisie to manifest itself as the universal class, is completely falsified by Sade, to the point of its becoming in him a source of grim humor. It is in this way that this thought, at the very heart of madness, still retains a lively power of debate. By the very use which it makes of them, it contributes to overthrowing the bourgeois ideas of analytical reason, natural goodness, progress, equality, universal harmony. Sade, I've never heard this name said out loud. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing it wrong. Sade or Sade, I don't know. Sade's pessimism joins that of the manual laborer, to whom the bourgeois revolution gave nothing, and who perceived at about 1794 that he was excluded from that universal class. It is removed from revolutionary optimism on both sides at once. Culture is only one example. The ambiguity of political and social action results most often from profound contradictions between the needs, the motives of the act, the immediate project, and, on the other side, the collective apparatus of the social field, that is, the instruments of praxis. Marx, who spent a long time studying the French Revolution, derived from his study a theoretical principle which we accept. At a certain stage in their development, the productive forces come into conflict with the relations of production, and the period which begins then is revolutionary. There is no doubt, in fact, that commerce and industry were stifled in 1789 by the regulations and particularisms which characterized feudal ownership. Thus we find here the explanation of a certain class conflict, that between the bourgeoisie and the nobility. Thus the general structures and the fundamental movement of the French Revolution are determined. But we must observe that the bourgeois class, although industrialization was just beginning, had a clear awareness of its needs and its powers. It was adult. It had at its disposal all the technicians, all the techniques, all the tools. Things are totally different when we want to study a particular moment in that history. For example, the action of the sans-culottes against the Commune of Paris and the Convention. The starting point is simple. The people suffered terribly from lack of food. There was a famine, and they wanted to eat. There is the need, there is the motive, and here is the basic project, still general and vague, but immediate, to act upon the authorities so as to obtain a rapid improvement in the situation. This basic situation is revolutionary on condition that instruments for action are found and that a policy is defined by the use which will be made of the instruments. Now, the group of sans-culottes is composed of heterogeneous elements. It joins together petit bourgeois, craftsmen, workers, the majority of whom possess their own tools. This semi-proletarian segment of the Third Estate, one of our historians, Georges Lefebvre, has called it a popular front, remains attached to the system of private property. It would hope to make of the latter a sort of social duty. Hence, it intends to limit a commercial freedom that tends to encourage monopolies. Now, this ethical conception of bourgeois property does not proceed unequivocally. Later, it will be one of the favorite mystifications of the imperialistic bourgeoisie. But in 1793, it appears primarily as the residue of a certain feudal, paternalistic concept, which had its birth under the Ancien Régime. The relations of production under feudalism found their symbol in the legal thesis of absolute monarchy. The king eminently possesses the land, and his property is identified with the property of his people. Those subjects who are landholders receive from his bounty the constantly renewed guarantee of their property. In the name of this ambiguous idea, which they remember without recognizing its outmoded character, the sans-culottes demand taxation. Now taxation is at the same time a recollection and an anticipation. It is an anticipation for those groups who are most fully aware, demand of the revolution or revolutionary government, that it sacrifice everything to the building up and defense of a democratic republic. War leads necessarily to economic planning. That, in one sense, is what they want to say. But this new demand is expressed by means of an ancient signification, which twists its direction toward a practice of the hated monarchy. Taxation, price ceilings, control of markets, public granaries. Such were the methods constantly employed in the 18th century to combat famine. In the program proposed by the people, the Montagnards as well as the Girondists recognized with horror the authoritarian customs of the regime which they had just demolished. It is a step backward. Their economists are unanimous in declaring that only complete freedom to produce and to trade can bring back abundance. It has been claimed that the representatives of the bourgeoisie were defending special interests. That is certain, but it is not the essential. Freedom found its most persistent defenders among the Girondists, who are said to have represented primarily ship owners, bankers, international trade. The interests of these upper bourgeois could not be affected by the taxation of grain. It is claimed, and rightly, that the Montagnards, who let their hand be forced, were particularly supported by the purchasers of national properties, who were in danger of having their profit limited by taxes. Roland, the sworn enemy of economic planning, held no property. In fact, these members of the convention, for the most part poor, intellectuals, lawyers, petty officials, had an ideological and practical passion for economic freedom. In it, the general interest of the bourgeois class was objectified. They wished to construct the future even more than they wanted to manage the present. In their eyes, free production, free circulation, free competition were the three indissoluble conditions of progress. Yes, passionately progressive, they wanted to advance history, and they advanced it, in fact, by reducing property ownership to the direct relation of the possessor with the thing possessed. In these terms, everything becomes complex and difficult. How are we to evaluate the meaning of the conflict objectively? Are these bourgeois moving in the direction of history when they oppose even the most moderate economic control? Was an authoritarian war economy premature? Would it have encountered insurmountable resistance? Would it have been necessary for capitalism to develop its internal contradictions in order for certain bourgeois to adopt certain forms of a planned economy? And the sans-culottes? They exercise their fundamental right in demanding the satisfaction of their needs. But isn't the method which they propose going to take them backward? Are they, as some Marxists have dared to say, the rear guard of the revolution? It is true that the demand for price ceilings, through the memories which it awakened, revived the past in the minds of some of the starving. Forgetting the families of the 80s, they cried out, "At the time of the kings, we had bread." Of course, others took the regulations in quite a different sense, anticipating through them a socialism. But this socialism was only a mirage, since there was no means of realizing it. Furthermore, it was vague. Babeuf, said Marx, came too late and too soon. On the one side, was it not the people themselves, the people of the sans-culottes, who made the revolution? Wasn't Thermidor rendered possible by the growing dissension between the sans-culottes and the controlling faction of the members of the convention? And Robespierre's dream of a nation with neither rich nor poor, where everybody was a property owner, was not that too going against the current? To give first place to the necessities of the struggle against the reaction within, against the armies of the hostile powers, to realize the bourgeois revolution fully and to defend it, such was, to be sure, the only task of the National Convention. But since this revolution was made by the people, was it not necessary to integrate in it the popular demands? At the beginning, the famine helped. If bread had been cheap, writes Georges Lefebvre, the brutal intervention of the people, which was indispensable for assuring the fall of the Ancien Regime, would perhaps not have taken place, and the bourgeoisie would not have triumphed so easily. But starting with the moment when the bourgeoisie overthrew Louis XVI, from the moment when its representatives assumed plenary responsibilities in its name, it was necessary for the popular force to intervene in support of government and institutions, no longer to overthrow them. And how could this aim be accomplished without giving satisfaction to the people? Thus the situation, the survival of ancient significations, the embryonic development of industry and of the proletariat, an abstract ideology of universality, all contribute to deviate both the bourgeois action and the popular action. It is true that the people supported the revolution, and true too that their distress had counter-revolutionary tendencies. It is true that their political hatred of the vanished regime varied according to circumstances, tending either to disguise the people's social demands or to give way before them. It is true that no genuine synthesis of the political and the social could be attempted, since the revolution was in fact paving the way for the advent of bourgeois exploitation. It is true that bourgeoisie bent on conquering was truly the revolutionary avant-garde, but it is true also that it was resolved at the same time to finish the revolution. It is true that by effecting a veritable social upheaval under the pressure of the radicals, the bourgeoisie would have generalized the civil war and handed the country over to foreigners. But it is true too that by discouraging the revolutionary ardor of the people, it was preparing for defeat and the return of the Bourbons at some date sooner or later. And then it gave in. It voted for the price ceiling. The Montagnards considered this vote a compromise and publicly apologized for it. We are in a besieged fortress. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that the myth of the besieged fortress was charged with justifying a revolutionary government's compromise with its principles under pressure of necessity. But the economic regulations seem not to have given the results which were counted on. At bottom, the situation did not change. When the sans-culottes returned to the convention on September 5th, 1793, they are still hungry, but this time again they lack the requisite instruments. They are unable to think that the rise in the price of commodities has general causes due to the system of assignats, that is, to the bourgeois refusal to finance the war by taxes. They still imagine that their misery is brought about by counter-revolutionaries. The petit bourgeois members of the convention, for their part, cannot incriminate the system without condemning economic liberalism. They too are reduced to invoking enemies. Hence that strange day of dupery when Belaud-Varenne and Robespierre taking advantage of the fact that the popular delegation demanded the punishment of those responsible, are going to make use of the obscure anger of the people, whose real motives are economic, to support the enforcement of a political terror. The people will see heads fall, but it will remain without bread. The controlling bourgeoisie, because it is neither willing nor able to change the system, is going to be decimated itself until Thermidor, reaction, and Bonaparte. We see that it is a struggle in the dark. In each of these groups, the original movement is deviated by the necessities of expression and action, by the objective limitation of the field of instruments, theoretical and practical, by the survival of outdated significations and the ambiguity of new significations. Very often, moreover, the second are expressed through the first. Starting here, a task is imposed upon us. This is to recognize the irreducible originality of the social political groups thus formed and to define them in their very complexity, in terms of their incomplete development and their deviated objectification. We must avoid idealist significations. We will refuse altogether to assimilate the sans-culottes to a true proletariat and to deny the existence of an embryonic proletariat. We will refuse, save in cases where actual experience imposes it on us, to regard a group as the subject of history or to affirm the absolute right of the bourgeois of 1793, the bearer of the revolution. We shall consider, in short, that an already lived history resists any a priori schematism. What are you doing, you doofus? We shall understand that even this history, made and known, incident by incident, must be for us the object of a complete experience. We shall tax the contemporary Marxist with considering it to be the dead, transparent object of an immutable knowledge. We shall insist on the ambiguity of the past facts. And by ambiguity, I do not mean, as Kierkegaard would, some sort of equivocal irrationality, but simply a contradiction which has never arrived at its point of maturity. It will be entirely proper to clarify the present by the future, the embryonic contradiction by the contradiction explicitly developed, and to leave to the present the equivocal aspects which it retains from its lived disparity. Existentialism, then, can only affirm the specificity of the historical event. It seeks to restore to the event its function and its multiple dimensions. Of course, Marxists do not ignore the event. In their eyes, it expresses the structure of society, the form which the class struggle has assumed, the relations of force, the ascending movement of the rising class, the contradictions which at the center of each class set particular groups with different interests in opposition to each other. But a Marxist aphorism shows how for almost 100 years now, Marxists have tended not to attach much importance to the event. The outstanding event of the 18th century, they say, would not be the French Revolution, but the appearance of the steam engine. Marx did not move in this direction, as is demonstrated very well by his excellent article, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. But today the fact, like the person, tends to become more and more symbolic. The duty of the event is to verify the a priori analyses of the situation, or at least not to contradict them. Thus, French communists tend to describe facts in terms of what can be or must be. Here is how one of them, and not one of the least important, explains the Soviet intervention in Hungary. Certain workers could be deceived, could commit themselves to a path which they did not believe to be that in which the counter-revolution was involving them, but subsequently these workers could not help reflecting on the consequences of this policy. They could not do otherwise than be uneasy at seeing, etc. They could not, without indignation, see the return of the regent, Horthy, It is entirely natural that under such circumstances, the formation of the present Hungarian government has answered the prayers and expectation of the working class in Hungary. In this passage, the purpose of which is more political than theoretical, we are not told what the Hungarian workers did, but what they were unable not to do. And why were they unable? Because they could not contradict their eternal essence as socialist workers. In a curious way, this Stalinized Marxism assumes an air of immobility. A worker is not a real being who changes with the world. He is a Platonic idea. Indeed, in Plato, the ideas are the eternal, the universal, the true. The motion and the event, as confused reflections of these static forms, are outside of truth. Plato seeks to approach them through myths. In the Stalinist world, the event is an edifying myth. Here we find what we might call the theoretical foundation for those fake confessions. The man who says, I have committed such and such an offense, such an act of treason, is performing a mythical stereotyped recital with no concern for verisimilitude, because he is asked to present his so-called crimes as the symbolic expression of an eternal essence. For example, the 1950 confession of abominable acts was for the purpose of unveiling the true nature of the Yugoslav regime. For us, the most remarkable thing is the fact that the contradictions and errors in date with which the confessions of Rajk were crammed full never awakened in the communists the vaguest suspicion. The materiality of fact is of no interest to these idealists. Only its symbolic implications count in their eyes. In other words, Stalinist Marxists are blind to events. When they have reduced the meaning of them to the universal, they are quite willing to recognize that a residue remains, but they make of this residue the simple effect of chance. Fortuitous circumstances have been the occasional cause of what could not be dissolved. Date, development, phases, origin and character of agents, ambiguity, misunderstandings, etc. Thus, like individuals in particular enterprises, the lived falls over to the side of the irrational, the unutilizable, and the theoretician considers it to be non-signifying.